You're good. Good morning, everybody. Don't anybody panic. I'm not the real preacher. I think I overheard Dennis telling somebody I'm the surreal preacher. That's probably more accurate. Rex is out of town today, so we're going to pick up where we left off last week. So we'll be in Luke chapter 8 in just a minute. And if this is your first time here, we're glad that you're here. And if it's not your first time, whether it's your first time or even, well, maybe your last time, we're glad you're here. We'll start in verse 40. I love this story. It's a great story. It's not just a story. It's a story within a story. It's about two 12-year-olds. There's a little girl. She didn't get a fair shot. Her life was snuffed out after just 12 short years. And then there's an older woman. She had been struggling with an incurable disease for 12 years. For 12 long years, she couldn't find an answer to her solution. Let's pick up in verse 40. When Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Think about it for just a minute. Who was this crowd? Where did these people come from? They were there, they were greeting Jesus because they were expecting him, but where did they come from? Who were they? Those he healed. People that heard about what he had done, wanted to maybe see what he was all about. In the mid-90s, I lived in Dallas, and it was a day that I didn't get very often, but it was a day off, and I slept late, so I was still asleep. And a friend of mine named Mike Mahan, he called me and woke me up, and he said, "Hey, man, you want to go to downtown West End? Because Van Halen's putting on a free concert today." They were doing a makeup concert from when Sammy had gotten sick a couple of years earlier. So I jumped out of bed, got dressed, and we rushed. Please. We rushed down to West End and got there before noon, sometime in the morning, and they didn't take the stage until about 5 or 6 that night. So we were there plenty early to have gotten really close to the stage. I thought we would have been even closer than what we were, but by the time they took the stage, you could look behind us and there was a crowd of about 4 miles worth of people behind us and maybe a quarter mile of people in front of us. So we were fairly close, but the crowd got big, the crowd got condensed and tight to the point where you didn't even have control over movement of your body. However the crowd swayed and moved, you moved with it. It was a little bit weird. I'd never been in a crowd like that, and I don't want to be in one like that again. If you had an emergency or you had to get out of there, the only way out was straight up. They have to lift you straight up, and then you were paddled overhead until you got way over to the edge of the crowd and were able to put your feet on the ground. That's the kind of crowd that 4 ugly guys with big hair who could play some good music were able to bring. But what about this crowd? This crowd, they were waiting for Jesus, they were expecting Jesus, they welcomed him because they knew something about him, they had heard something about him. Some of the people in this crowd had been hearing things about him for more than 30 years before he was even born. And you and I remember the stories because we've read them, but these people were there. They were listening to the stories. They were hearing about the experiences, even 30 years before. And you remember it was Gabriel the angel who came to Mary the Virgin, and he said, you're going to have a baby, and the Holy Spirit is going to make that happen. And then there were angels who went out into the field where the shepherds were tending to the sheep. And the angels said, the Messiah has been born, go and see him. A magic star appeared in the sky, and it went several different directions to take those men from the field where they were working all the way to the little town of Bethlehem, all the way to the exact spot where the baby Jesus had been born. Mary and Joseph, a few days later, they took that baby Jesus. They took him to the temple to present him. And you remember there was a prophet there. His name was Simeon, and he saw the baby Jesus, and immediately he began to prophesy. And there was a prophetess, and her name was Anna. And when she laid eyes on the baby, she immediately recognized him as the Redeemer of the world. Now, his mom and dad took that baby back home, where he continued to grow in wisdom and stature with both God and man. And then one day, he was 12 years old, and he made his way to the temple, because the only thing that he wanted to do, the only interest that was in his heart, was to know all he could know about the book that his father had written. And he knew that the temple would be the place to do that, because there were men there who spent their entire lives studying that book. And so he went to learn from them. But instead what happened, those teachers were amazed at that 12-year-old. Now Mary and Joseph, they didn't know where Jesus was. They didn't know he'd left. They had filed a missing persons report 3 days earlier. When they found him, they grounded him for 18 years. So when he turned 30, on his 30th birthday, they unlocked his bedroom door, and they let him out of the house. He went down to the river where his cousin was. He walked into the river, and he said, John, baptize me. John took Jesus, pushed him under the water, pulled him back up, and at that moment the sky unzipped, and the Holy Spirit inside of a dove flew down, and the voice of God thundered through the universe and said, this is my son, and I love him. If you didn't know anything about Jesus before, you knew something about him right then. Jesus walked up out of that river, and he walked into a town called Capernaum, and he started his ministry. There was a man there who had been possessed by a demon. He ran up to Jesus and he said, I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God. And Jesus said, shut up, get out. And he did. And the man went back to normal. The crowd went wild, and the news started to spread. Jesus went home with his friend Simon, and when they got there, they discovered that his mother-in-law was sick in bed with a fever. So Jesus healed her. Immediately, she got up. She started making dinner for everybody. The family went wild, and the news kept spreading. Later on, Peter, along with his other buddies that were all fishermen, they went out and they got into the boat. They fished all night. You remember the story. They didn't catch anything. They're on their way back, and Jesus said, hey, throw your nets over the boat. So they did, and they went from no fish to, whoa, fish. Fish were diving into the nets, breaking the nets. You remember, and they were pulling them into the boat, and the boats were sinking, and the men in the boats were falling to their knees because they knew that Jesus was no average Joe. They continue on their way, where they come across a leper, a man whose body had been destroyed, a man whose life had been destroyed from this illness. And he came to Jesus and he said, if you will, you can make me clean. Jesus said, I can, I will, and he did. And he changed that man's life forever. And the crowd went wild, and the news kept spreading. Spread so far, in fact, to a group of guys who had a friend. He was paralyzed. He was flat on a mat. They picked him up. They took him to the place where Jesus was teaching. But they couldn't get anywhere close to Jesus. They couldn't even see him because of the size of the crowd. They climbed up on top of the house. They busted out the roof. They let that man down. next to Jesus. Jesus saw their faith and he healed him. He forgave him before he healed him, but he healed him. Again, the crowds went wild and the news kept spreading. And you remember as they were on their way, they were stopped by a funeral procession. There was a widow lady from Nain. Her heart had been filled with pain because she had lost her husband, and then today she lost her only son. The woman was left alone, and she was left lonely. Jesus had compassion on her, and he approached her, and he reached up into the sky, and he grabbed the spirit of that boy, and he put it back into his body, and he gave that woman her son back. They continued on their way. They needed to cross the lake. They all got into the boat. Jesus was wiped out. He takes a nap in the boat. They set sail. And on their journey, a storm broke out. A big storm. A life-threatening kind of storm. They thought they were going to die. And they thought Jesus didn't care. I don't know how they woke Jesus up. I don't know if they yelled at him. I don't know if they shook him. I don't know if they threw a fish at him. But they woke Jesus up. Jesus woke up and he said, "Stop!" And the whole world listened. The wind stopped. The rain stopped. And the lake became like glass. And you remember the story. It was in the middle of the night. Their ship came to shore in a cemetery, and there was a psycho wearing his birthday suit because he had been possessed by a multitude of demons. Jesus cast those demons out of that man into a herd of pigs that was nearby. Those pigs rushed off the side of the cliff into the water and they drowned. And we see the man next time clothed and in his right mind. And Jesus said, "Now you go home and you tell everybody what God has done for you." He did. The crowds went wild, and the news continued to spread. How fast does news spread? Instantly, right? How far does news travel? All around the globe. Let's go back to this crowd. Who had heard of Jesus? Who had heard of Jesus? Everybody. Who was in this crowd? Everybody. They had seen the things he had done. They had heard the things that he taught. What kind of crowd was this crowd? It was a Van Halen kind of crowd. Look at verse 41. Just then, a man named Jairus came. He was a leader of the synagogue. He fell down at Jesus' feet and pleaded with him to come to his house because he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. We know about Jesus, and we know about this crowd. What do we know about this man? From these verses, what do we know about this guy? Synagogue official. He was a leader. And all leaders carry that position with some level of power. What kind of leader was he? A leader of the synagogue. He was a man of God. He was a man that people respected and they trusted because he had integrity, because he was pious. What else do we know about him? What was that? He believed Jesus. He was a man of God and he was familiar with some of the prophecies of God. What was his name? Jairus. People knew him. When they saw him, they recognized him because he was prominent in that community. Typically people who are prominent, they have a position that wields some power, and they're pious, they have integrity, they have respect for the people. What tends to accompany people like that? He did okay for himself, didn't he? He had a pension plan. He was going places. This guy was somebody. Where's the first place that we meet Jairus? At Jesus' feet. He's in the dirt on the ground at the feet of Jesus. And he's in full-out panic mode, isn't he? He's having a panic attack, and he's pleading with Jesus to come back home with him because his pretty little girl is sick and dying, and she's all that he has. When you get that kind of a text message on your phone, when you get that emergency text message, and I don't mean like Val, I've chipped an acrylic nail, but I mean a real emergency. When you get an emergency text message, what do you send back? What's your reply? I'll be right there. OMW, on my way. And you say that as you're running out the door and you're hitting your clicker or you're doing your auto start, put it in reverse and you hit send and you're on your way. Look at the second part of verse 42. I like my other Bible better because it says, on their way, OTW. Jesus responded right away. He didn't have time to think. He didn't stop to think. He heard the plea of Jairus and he knew the situation of this little girl and he dropped everything and they were on their way. They were on their way out of that Van Halen kind of crowd, on their way to the house where Jairus' little girl was sick and dying. This Bible says while he was going, the crowds were nearly crushing him. I like that word. It's a word that if you owned a vineyard and you were a winemaker, it's the same word that you use for what you do to a grape when you're making wine. Jesus was being crushed like a grape at a vineyard because of that Van Halen kind of crowd. Verse 43. A woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years, who had spent all she had on doctors and yet could not be healed by any, approached from behind and touched the end of his robe. Instantly, her bleeding stopped. So we know about Jesus, we know about the crowd, and we know about Jairus. Tell me what you know about this woman.
Unable to worship God for 12 years.
She was unable to worship God. The kind of illness she had fell in the same category as leprosy. And so for 12 long years, this woman had been cut off from her friends and her family, cut off from her church and her community. She was untouchable. Where was her daughter? Where was her family? Where were her friends? She was unattached. What was her name? She was unknown. And after 12 long years, she had become invisible. She was going nowhere fast. And the truth is, she had become a nobody. I don't know how she got to Jesus. After 12 years of bleeding, I'm sure she was anemic. I'm sure she was weak. I don't know if she had the strength to be able to get to that crowd and to push her way through those hundreds of people. I don't know. She was on the ground. Maybe she had to crawl through a sea of legs just to get to Jesus while all her fingers were being stepped on. She knew the same thing Jairus knew. She had one last chance. She had one opportunity for help, and he was right in front of her. And so she reached out and was able, with the tip of her finger, to touch the edge of his robe. And immediately, she was made well. Jesus stopped in his tracks. He's on his way out of the crowd. He and Jairus are rushing to get to his house. Jesus stopped in his tracks and he said, look what he said in verse 45. Who touched me? The disciples were, what are you, nuts? Everybody's touching you. Look, we're being crushed like grapes here. But Jesus, out of all the hundreds of people that were touching him, only one who had faith that he was the Son of God and had the power of God touched him, and he knew it because he felt the power leave his body. Look at what he said. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the crowds are hemming you in and pressing against you. Someone did touch me, he said. I know that power has gone out from me. And when the woman saw that she was discovered, she came trembling and fell down before him. And in the presence of all the people, she declared the reason she had touched him and how she was instantly healed. Jesus said, Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Our faith, the same kind of faith that lived in her, our faith brings the power of God into our lives. Faith is kind of like a highway. Faith is like a freeway that the will of God travels on to reach its destination in our lives. So the will of God meets us when we have faith and believe in Him that He's going to do what He says. And at that point, the power of God comes into our lives. What did Jesus call her? Do you know it's the only time? It's the only time Jesus ever called anyone daughter. Why would He pick this woman? She was unknown. She was unemployed. She was unattached. She was untouchable. She had faith. Why do you think out of all the women that Jesus ever encountered, this was the only one that He called daughter? She needed that. She was isolated. She was alone. She needed to know that she belonged somewhere. You know, Jesus, even though she was a complete stranger, didn't have anything going for her, and really, for all practical purposes, had become completely invisible. Jesus loved this stranger just as much as Jairus loved his daughter. I think if we don't learn anything today, if we just know we're never a nobody to Jesus. You are never a nobody to Jesus. It doesn't matter where you came from. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter who you are. You are not a nobody, not to Jesus. What about Jairus' daughter? We were on our way there. We were trying to race out of that crowd and get to her. And you remember Jairus, he was desperate. It was his only daughter, and she was dying. We were on our way and we got interrupted. This nobody reached out and touched Jesus. And he engaged in a conversation with her. Jairus was desperate. He knew that this was his last shot. And you know he had done everything he could. You know that he had rushed her to the ER. You know that he went to the pharmacy and got all the meds and made sure that every hour on the hour she was taking her meds. They kept her in bed for rest. They kept all the Gatorade and the Powerade on the nightstands. They kept her hydrated. And her bedside was lined with all of her friends and family, praying constantly that there would be a miracle from God for that little girl. But the clock ran out. Verse 49. While he was still speaking, while Jesus was still talking to this woman. Jairus is standing there in full panic mode, and he's scanning the crowd, and he sees his friend. They lock eyes. And he knew. Nobody had to tell him. But that friend continued to make his way through that crowd until he came nose to nose with Jairus. And he said, she's gone. No reason to bother the teacher anymore. You feel that daddy's heart fall to his feet? Can you hear the life breath leave his lungs? And his chin drops to his chest, and you hear the thud on the ground when his knees drop to the dirt. And inside of his head, that same old question that we always ask, replayed over and over, again and again. Why? God, why? We were so close. Why did she have to touch him right now? Why did he have to stop? She was already healed. Why on earth did he have to have this conversation with her? He knew my desperation. He knew my little girl was dying. Why did it have to happen like this? She was only 12. She'd never get to know what it was like to spend her Saturdays at the mall with her friends. She'd never get to live life as a teenager. And her favorite guy would never get the opportunity to pin that corsage on her shiny new prom dress, get a picture with her, take that home, put it in the picture album, and keep it for the rest of their lives. She'd never have that nerve-wracking experience of taking that driving test and, finally acing it and getting that smiley face picture while she holds her chariot license up. And her parents, they never get to throw her that sweet 16 party with that new dress and all of her friends and family and that fantastic food. She'd never feel the electricity in her heart from having that first crush. She'd never get that tingling feeling behind her eyes from that first kiss. And she wouldn't get the chance to tell her mom about just how cute he is, because he's got that short curly brown hair and he's got those big dark chocolate eyes, and he buys all of his robes from the Buckle. And his sandals, they're Hey Dudes because that's the only brand he wears. And all of his dress shirts, he's got that little embroidered camel right here. She'd never get the chance to make her parents' chests swell with pride by being the first one to graduate college and walk across that stage and take that diploma and go and get a successful career. And her daddy, he'd never get the chance to walk down that synagogue aisle where she had grown up with all of her friends and family and give her hand away in marriage to what had one time been a 12-year-old curly-headed little boy who wore all the right clothes, but had grown up into just the right kind of man for her. Jairus would never get his moment to fret and pace inside that waiting room at the hospital, waiting for that nurse to come to let him know if he had a grandson or a granddaughter. And don't you? You know that if it was a granddaughter, he had already planned the biggest birthday bash in history the day that little girl turned 12. Because, man, were they going to celebrate. Look at verse 50. When Jesus heard it, When Jesus heard the friend, "Your daughter's dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." When Jesus heard it, he answered and said, "Don't be afraid. Just believe and she'll be fine. Just believe and she'll be saved." So they're on their way again. We're on our way out of the crowd. And this time, it's Jesus who's going to the crowd. He's going to the crowd at the house. And it's a loud crowd because people are wailing and they're crying because the wound is fresh. They're in shock. They don't understand why this had to happen. And he walks through that crowd and he tells them, verse 51, after he came to the house, he let no one enter with him except Peter, James, and John, and the child's father and mother. Everyone was crying and mourning for her. But he said, "Stop crying, because she's not dead. She's just asleep." They laughed at him because they knew she was dead. This time, it's Jesus who reaches out and touches her. He reaches out and he takes the girl by the hand and he said, "Get up." Her spirit returned and she got up at once. Then he gave orders that she be given something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he instructed them not to tell anyone what had happened. Every sad beginning doesn't have to have a sad ending. Because Jesus can do things that you and I could never even imagine possible. And the truth is, it's never too late for Jesus. With Jesus. Even when it's too late, it's not too late with Jesus. Because it doesn't matter where you came from. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter what your family thinks of you. It doesn't matter what your friends think of you. It doesn't even matter what you think of you. Because Jesus can make the difference. And once you've done everything you knew to do, once you've tried everything and nothing has worked, nothing gets any better, it's only getting worse. You got one last shot. There's still hope. However you get to him, get to Jesus. It doesn't matter if you run, if you crawl, if you fall at his feet. Go to Jesus and let him know you need his help. And trust and believe that he loves you enough, just like he loved that stranger, just like he loved this little girl. Trust and know that he loves you enough. And then you step back and you wait for the power of God to enter into your life. Because he can change everything. He can change everything. We're going to keep on thinking about Jesus. We're going to think about the life he lived. We're going to remember the way he loved people. We're going to remember the death he died. All for one reason. Because he loves people and he wants to be in relationship with us. You may be here for the first time. The guys are going to pass some trays around. They've got 2 cups. One has bread, one has juice. And it doesn't matter what order you take those in. It doesn't matter if you take them both at the same time. The only thing that matters is that you think about Jesus and you remember the love he has, you remember the life he lived, and the death he died so that we could have a relationship with him. So we think about that and we thank God for the sacrifices he made so that we can be just like that woman and be called a daughter or a son of God.